Welcome back to another episode of the Wisdom Rising podcast. I am joined today by shamanic teacher Paul Francis for a conversation on shamanism and particularly his aspects and his perspective on therapeutic shamanism. So, Paul, welcome to the show. I am so excited and honored to have this conversation with you today.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really excited and honored you invited me. It's very kind of you.
Beautiful. Well, as listeners will know, my favorite question to start these podcasts with is just in your own words, can you tell us how you got to where you are today?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a big question. um, well, in terms of shamanism, which is, I guess, is what you're mostly interested in, um, I people often ask what my sort of first shamanic experiences are, and I had a lot of experiences in childhood that, with hindsight, I now see they were very shamanic. At the time, I had no idea what on earth was happening to me because I had nobody around me who understood shamanism or animism. I mean, I was brought up by a vicar, a Church of England vicar, so I mean, my background was Christianity. And so the kinds of things that were happening to me in terms of feeling connections with animals and plants and things, I just honestly had nobody to talk to about it. I then went to university, and as well as the subject you had to sign up for, we had to sign up for two of the subjects in the first year and then make a choice at the end of the year. And I signed up to do anthropology, and to this day I have no idea why I signed up for it because I had no idea what it even meant really. I just knew I had to do it. And there's a guy called Daniel Quinn who's written some amazing books, this Ishmael and the Story of Bee and things you might know. And he wrote a book called Providence, which is his sort of short autobiography. And he said it's often only towards the end of your life, or as you get older, you can look back and see the times where your soul was calling to you. And that was definitely one of those times because I ended up studying anthropology. And even though at the time we weren't really using the word shamanic much, we were still, I mean, horribly using the term primitive cultures. Basically, I was studying animist and shamanic cultures. And when I finished university, I thought, well, that was great fun for 3 years, but I've no idea what to do with an anthropology degree, anthropology and philosophy. But actually, as I look back over my life, it changed everything. And so I trained as a psychotherapist in my 20s, and was exploring shamanism a lot in that decade of my life as well. I felt very, very uneasy with what I came across in a lot of the shamanic world in terms of non-existent ethics from a psychotherapy point of view, a lot of quite abusive behavior, really. And so I kind of went away from shamanism, or I thought I did. But my psychotherapy work, I got very into body-centered work, which is often you're working with people who are kind of in quite altered state of consciousness, and they're kind of, they're describing their symptoms in sort of metaphors and imagery and stuff. And I started to realize actually this was still very shamanic in many ways. And then in my mid 30s, I suffered a series of events that led to me, long story, but basically ended up with really, really, really severe sort of suicidal post-traumatic stress disorder. And I completely broke down, really. And it was at that point that shamanism just came crashing back into my life. And I've never looked back since, really. I never, ever, ever thought I would be a shamanic teacher. My shamanism for me was something intensely personal and private. But it was probably my mid 40s, my guides started nagging me to teach. And I refused for years, and they just kept on and on. And eventually I gave in, and to my surprise, people loved it. And so I set up the college eventually in 2007, and then started, published first book 2017, and here we are. And it's my life. basically, which is feels an honour and a privilege, really, and a joy. So, does that answer your question?
It does. That was beautiful. There are so many aspects of that journey that I would love to dive into, but one of my first questions is you went from anthropology to psychotherapy. What prompted that switch and why did you decide to pursue psychotherapy?
Um, highly dysfunctional child.
I used to have a psychology teacher who would tell me that research is me search in kind of the same vein if we go into
Yeah,
psychology to try and heal ourselves. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, absolutely. That was absolutely the case for me. Um, Again, honestly, though, I mean, with hindsight, I think that is the answer. I was absolutely trying to heal myself because I had a pretty terrible childhood, as most psychotherapists I know have had, actually. But again, it was just one of those weird things. I finished university and about a month earlier, and my girlfriend at the time said, "Oh, there's this psychotherapy weekend going on. Do you want to come along with me?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." I had no idea what it was, but I remember sitting there in the first hour and experiencing people actually properly listening to each other and being kind and empathic. And it felt like I was a fish being put back into water finally. I just thought, oh, thank God, this is where I want to be, really. And so psychotherapy is the other strand along with shamanism that's kind of completely central to my life, really. I love psychotherapy with a passion.
And so how did that kind of because you're the founder, I think I could call you of therapeutic shamanism, which is how
Mm.
I first found you and wanted to have you on the show for talking about that perspective. So how did that blend happen for you and how do you see those intersections?
Well, I mean, a lot of people do say that shamanism was like a sort of our earliest form of psychotherapy, and certainly there is a lot of overlap between shamanism and psychotherapy. There are really significant differences too, and I love both of them equally. And I think there is an enormous amount each of them can learn from the other. I mean, psychotherapy can learn a huge number of things from shamanism, but in particular, the importance of connection with the other than human.
Mm,
Psychotherapy tends to be done very much in like a human bubble. I mean, it's usually two humans sitting in a quite humanized environment and things. And although there are aspects of therapy that are going beyond that now, like ecotherapy and things, I mean, they're still very small and kind of in their infancy. And shamanism, kind of really central to it, is that our psychological, emotional, spiritual health is fundamentally based on healthy connection with the other than human too. So, and I think if psychotherapy doesn't take that on board, I mean, a lot of what is wrong with us is our broken connection with the other than human world. And if therapy just keeps reducing everything down to humanness, it becomes part of the problem in the end. And it becomes a way of, it's like the opium, of the people, like religion used to be. It just becomes a way of making people feel better without addressing this really fundamental issue. So that's one of the many things I think psychotherapy needs to learn from shamanism. And shamanism, I mean, shamanism is really ancient, so it might sound absurd that it has anything to learn from something as new as psychotherapy, which is only just over 100 years old, let's face it. But psychotherapy arose to try to deal with the catastrophic mental health issues that we've been suffering for literally the last 4 to 6,000 years with the birth of what we ridiculously call civilization. And that what we've been through over the last few thousand years has profoundly changed us. We're no longer wired in the same way that we were as Indigenous people. So a lot of the techniques that developed in Indigenous cultures simply don't kind of stick as well. They don't last as well. They don't take root as well these days. Things like soul retrieval is an example, and that's because they don't they didn't evolve understanding how we are now, essentially. And psychotherapy does. I mean, it understands a lot of, like things like attachment theory and stuff. It understands a lot about the mess we're in, mentally, emotionally now. And so you can take all the traditional shamanic techniques and then tweak them and adapt them with the insights of psychotherapy to make them far more effective and much more appropriate to the times we live in now. And actually, shamanism has always done this. Shamanism is one of the things I love about it is it's incredibly pragmatic. There's a saying in shamanism: "Does it grow corn?" In other words, does it work? And what shamans have always done is take this really, really ancient body of knowledge and practices, and they've always just adapted it to make it useful to the particular times they're living. And we need to do the same. We need to take those ancient techniques and practices and make them adaptable to the environment we live in, like our ancestors have always done. And psychotherapy can really help us do that. The insights, because we've learned a lot in the last 100 years of psychotherapy. So that's my passion, is bringing the two together, really,
I'm curious.
without diminishing either. Hopefully, I mean, I think the sum of the whole becomes greater than the parts. So.
And I'm curious, can you give an example? You had mentioned soul retrieval as one of the practices that you tend to find doesn't stick as well in
Mm.
modern day practices. Can you share a little bit more about what your perspective on that is and how you're adapting it to find it to be more effective?
Yeah, sure. So really fundamental to shamanism is the concept of soul loss. It's the idea that parts of us can leave our body, essentially. And I mean, we actually do that all the time. Like when we're daydreaming, we can find ourselves on a tropical beach or something, and then we come back to our body and so on. And when we dream at night and so on, there's nothing weird about leaving your body. The point is, you should come back. And so soul loss happens when part of us leaves, gets traumatized, so it leaves, but it doesn't come back, and that leaves a hole in us. And from a shamanic point of view, that's dangerous. It makes us vulnerable, basically, to other things. It's like a weakened immune system. Things can get into us that shouldn't be in us. And so retrieval has always been a vital part of shamanism. It's the ability of a shaman to leave their own body on behalf of somebody, find that person's lost soul part, and then bring it back to them. Now, soul loss can happen for a lot of different reasons, like bereavement, for instance. Now, Indigenous people obviously suffer bereavements, and so they would go into grief and suffer soul loss. We say when somebody dies, it feels like part of they've taken part of me with them or something, or the light's gone out in the world or something. And so Indigenous people would suffer soul loss, of course, and they would be more than happy then for a shaman to do a soul retrieval and bring that part back. Now, the, one of the main ways we suffer soul loss in the present day is because of how we've been living for the last few thousand years. We're very proud often of kind of how clever we think we are as humans because of the way we've domesticated other species, other animals, and other plants to serve our needs. There's probably nothing on the planet we've domesticated and diminished as much as ourselves to fit into modern culture. I mean, think about doing a 9 to 5 job that you hate, you know, or sitting down and shutting up at school for 10 years of your life, and so on and so on. We've really, I mean, people are living lives that aren't making them happy a lot of the time in this culture, and have no choice because of economics and so on. So, in order to fit in with our dysfunctional culture, we send lots of parts of ourselves away. So, the main cause of soul loss these days is we send part of ourselves away. Think about if you were brought up in a dysfunctional family where it wasn't safe to be vulnerable, you send your vulnerability away, or it wasn't safe to be boisterous and playful, you send that part of you away to fit in. Now, so when it comes to adulthood, of course, people read about soul loss and think, oh, that sounds amazing. I have this real sense, there's something missing. Why wouldn't that person want that part back? The problem is, if they sent that part away, often, although part of them will, yes, of course, I want the soul retrieval. Part of them, the parts that sent that part away, are going to be resistant. I mean, what if you actually bring back your vulnerability? Does that really feel safe? Or you bring back your assertiveness or your anger or whatever it is you sent away? And that wasn't an issue in Indigenous cultures because people were basically psychologically much healthier than us. They had no problem with bringing things back because they hadn't sent that part away. It left because of other causes. So nowadays, what I used to find was when people would come to me saying, "Oh, I want a soul retrieval." If I did just a traditional soul retrieval, it often just wouldn't stick. I mean, sometimes it would, but maybe one time in 10, I'd feel like it had done the big change it should do. But a lot of the time, the change was partial or it wouldn't last. And because basically the parts that sent the soul part away just rearrange things, they just send it away all over again, essentially. People don't want to change because they're frightened of the consequences. So unless you address that, they're not ready for the soul retrieval. You have to negotiate with the parts that are worried and resistant. So what have you brought your anger back? How do you actually feel about that, or your vulnerability? You know, and until you've actually worked with those parts, and a lot of psychotherapy is understanding about we have parts of self that we need to dialogue with and so on. If you do that work, then you can do the soul retrieval and it'll stick. It's not a massive thing to do, but it makes all the difference. So that's just one example, really. Another just quick example is, as well as soul loss, the other way we get seriously ill from a shamanic perspective is what's called power loss. And what they, this means is disconnection from the greater than human world, from nature, basically. Now, Indigenous people, that wasn't an issue. They lived in and were part of nature, not apart from it. And so they never developed any techniques around this. Whereas now, obviously, when people come in off the street for a shamanic work, they usually live in lives that are completely disconnected from nature. And so we need a whole other set of techniques now to address that issue as well, that again just aren't there in Indigenous shamanism. So there's lots of examples I could give, but it's just a question of taking those shamanic things and then looking at, well, actually, how does this work or not work in the present day and how can we adjust it? Does that make sense?
It does, and I love hearing you talk about that. One of the things that I tell our students all the time is this idea that one of the very first things we learn how to do in this modern life is how to deny ourselves, to step away from ourselves, to, like you said, pull away our vulnerability or our assertiveness or these things that we learn to see as less than or not enough or dangerous in a lot of ways. And so that
Absolutely.
process of learning to be open to yourself again, I think it is an aspect of shamanic techniques that, like you said, it wasn't part of those core original teachings, and it is very much a modern perspective and a modern experience, and I think that in that, having techniques and things like shamanism and working through those core limiting beliefs and learning how to process those instances that taught you that who you are wasn't enough or wasn't safe or wasn't whatever it was, learning to process through those and rewire that story is such an important aspect of it. And that's something that we learn about shamanic techniques, and there are great studies right now showing that, we're changing our neural pathways when we do something like a
Mhm.
shamanic journey. And it's like
Mhm.
that process of taking psychotherapy, or one of my favorites is EMDR for processing trauma
Yeah,
and those neural pathways and resetting those so that then that shamanic work can go even deeper because our subconscious mind has created space for it.
absolutely. That's absolutely right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And these are things that we don't live in a culture that generally supports us in doing this. It's difficult doing this stuff in this culture. It's quite heroic, really. Was Indigenous cultures just weren't like that. There's I read once about in the Inuit cultures, if you didn't get on with your birth family, you were absolutely, as a child, you had the right to go into any other igloo, and those people had to adopt you, basically. So it was kind of recognized that you need to be brought up by the community, and that there would be people in that community who would be best suited to do that, not necessarily your birth parents. And in Hawaii, when a child was born, the kahuna, the shaman, would appoint an adult to watch that child an elder it was usually, to watch that baby for the first year of its life. And then on the child's birthday, the whole community would be called together, and the elder would say what they had seen of that child's soul potential and who best in the community could help that child to blossom into that. So what John says, Indigenous cultures were designed to help people grow and blossom emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. All Indigenous cultures had the rites of passage in adolescence that were the initiation into adulthood. And that was really about uh, what we would in psychotherapy call becoming a fully functioning person, or what did Maslow, a self-actualized person, that's what he called it. The cultures were designed to help people blossom and grow. We're not living in those cultures anymore. And so we have to find ways of doing that now. And shamanism can play a huge role in that, essentially.
I'm curious, in your practice and with your students and your clients, what are some of the most common ways? I know you touched on a few of them: working a 9 to 5 job, putting yourself in kind of a school box for 8 hours a day. But what are some of the most common ways that you find that people go through that process of denying themselves or stepping away from that inherent state where they are, putting themselves in a place of power loss or soul loss?
Well, all sorts of ways. So, I mean, in childhood, obviously, we are experimenting, we're trying strategies out, and those the solutions we come up with are designed to help us cope with the environment we found ourselves in, usually a family unit and the school environment and so on. But round about, I mean, it depending which psychological theory you believe, but round about the age of sort of 6, 7, 8, we tend to have settled on strategies, and then we simply start actually playing these out for the rest of our adult life. And of course, often what brings people to therapy is the kind of these aren't working anymore for them, but they don't understand why. So they have to kind of uncover the strategies, dismantle them, and develop healthier ones, of course. Now, Indigenous cultures understood this as well. That's what childhood was about. But they also understood that when you get to adolescence, you have to make a shift from being your childhood construct to actually being an adult. And this was hardwired into these cultures. They really understood the importance of this. The cultures were really based around helping people make this transition into proper adulthood. We don't have that anymore. So what we have is in teenage times, you are experimenting with different identities and so on and so on, but there's no guidance. And so most people don't actually individuate in a very healthy way in that time. They simply muddle through, and then it kind of hits them again in middle age or something, because they've never really found themselves. So most people basically are stuck in childhood in this culture and stuck in a whole pile of adaptive strategies and wonky concepts about who they are and things that aren't actually what their real self is at all. So in shamanism, we differentiate between what we call our middle world self, which is this day-to-day reality self, and our true soul, which is a different thing again. And your true soul is actually the real blueprint of what you were meant to be. But I mean, the truth is that in these days, most people will live and die never, ever actually knowing who they truly are. Um, they are just living out a whole pile of beliefs about who they are and how they should behave and so on and so on. And I mean, it sounds awful to say, but it is true. I mean, it's catastrophically awful, and no, nevertheless, it's true. I mean, what a terrible waste of human life the last few thousand years has been.
And that's you touched on it as well, but that is one of my personal favorite aspects of a shamanic practice is we've made such great strides as a culture, right? In
Mm,
some ways of
mm,
how we care for ourselves and our perspective of our mental health and the
mm.
frameworks that we can use to heal them. And at the same time, like you said at the beginning, the more we dive into those and the more importance and value we attach to healing our mental state, the further it takes us from healing that soul state and that spirit state and aligning the two. And I think that's something that right now it's a gap that I see, when we do research in psychology, we're always taught to identify the gaps in where the current knowledge is and that's something that I see as a big gap right now is we've put so much emphasis and importance on the mind and on mental health that we have stepped away from and lost the importance of that soul health and that soul alignment and your power and truth. And I I'm so grateful to find people like you who are dedicated to bridging the gap between the two and finding the ways that they can align and be balanced because there is a balance that has to take place. It can't just be one or the other, it
Absolutely,
has to be all of it.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, we have made enormous strides over the last 100 years or so in terms of, psychotherapy and understanding mental health. But I think it's no coincidence that in that time we're also seeing a resurgence of interest in shamanism. I mean, it's because it's part of trying to regain our sanity, essentially. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the mental health issues, I mean, understanding it on a mental level has its place, but what soul gives is much, much deeper roots for that, essentially. It provides a much, much deeper fertile ground for that to grow in, really. Yeah, and it is a missing piece in psychotherapy. I mean, not all psychotherapy, but most psychotherapy, obviously, still. Although I think if we were having this conversation in, 50 years' time, I think that will have changed a lot, assuming we're still here.
I hope so. I hope so.
Well, I don't think I will be. Let's.
Uh, I'm curious, one of the things that we've touched on throughout this conversation is that development in culture. And one of the things that you put so beautifully was the need to continue to adapt to our current circumstances. And there's a conversation that's been happening in our community in particular recently around things like cultural appropriation and how we can honor and respect our ancestors while also acknowledging that need for maintaining awareness of the times that we're in. And I'm curious to speak to you about this as someone who has that background in anthropology as well as the psychology and shamanic aspects of it. What are your perspectives around that conversation?
I mean, let's be honest, I'm a white male of a certain age of things. I mean, I'm aware of my privileges. And at the same time, I try to, you know, be aware of them, but I'm not perfect, obviously. But I do, with my shamanic work, I have tried very hard to draw on what's called core shamanism and not any particular indigenous cultures. Um, so, I mean, if anyone listening doesn't know, so the anthropologist Michael Harner, he was studying different shamanic cultures across the world. What he realized was that underneath the different cultural variations, he found there is what he called core shamanism, that there's a core set of principles and practices and beliefs. And these are extraordinarily consistent throughout the world. Um, I mean, to a degree that is quite extraordinary. And so in 1980, I think it was, he published his book, The Way of the Shaman. And a lot of the modern revival of shamanism is down to that book. I mean, there are criticisms people have upon this work, but we owe him an enormous debt of gratitude as well, I think. And so my approach has been very much to try to draw on core shamanism, not any particular tradition, not least because I live in the UK, and when I was exploring shamanism sort of in my 20s and things, I mean, there is no UK shamanism, of original Indigenous shamanism, obviously. So we were having to draw on rituals and practices and things from, different parts of the world. But it just used to feel weird to me to be sat in a terraced Victorian house in industrial northwest England, chanting things from Mongolia or something. It just used to feel weird, as well as being cultural appropriation. So I stopped it all. I stopped really looking at different cultures for a while, and I decided to learn just directly from my guides as much as possible. And so I would say most of what I teach is absolutely not culturally specific at all. And shamanism itself is everybody's birthright. It's, I mean, we're around 200,000 years old as a species, Homo sapiens, and for at least 190,000 years of that, we lived and breathed animism and shamanism. It was the way we experienced the world and lived in the world. Um, so it is everybody's birthright, and it's trying to draw on that really ancient wisdom and finding ways of applying it that are relevant to the cultures we live in. That's what I'm interested in, rather than a particular sort of modern day indigenous versions of it.
And
Whilst being trying to be really sensitive to the understandable pain, people have around that. So
absolutely. And I think it's a conversation that it does have so many different layers to it. And of course, like you said, as to white people of certain privilege, it's hard to have a well-rounded conversation about it. But I appreciate your perspective on that because it's one that at Moon Rising we agree with, of this idea of looking at those core principles of shamanism. And Michael Harner was such a powerful person in bringing shamanism to the West, not least because he did it in such a respectful way of as he traveled to these cultures and he experienced these practices, it was always with getting permission. There's not anything that he put in his books or in his teachings that he did not have explicit permission to bring back. And so I think when we look at that and when we look at those consistencies that happened across time and geography and culture, it really is, to me, that understanding that, like you said, shamanism is our birthright because we are nature and we are spirit. And those are just the ways that we inherently know how to connect and how to return to our roots. And sometimes I wonder, looping this back to our previous conversation, I wonder how much of that inherent knowing, right? Because there are things like the shamanic journey and connecting with our guides and power animals that are consistent across culture and time and geography. And to me, that shows that there is that inherent pull towards these ways of connecting with ourselves and with what you're calling the other than human. And I wonder sometimes if that inherent knowing that we all have this ability to connect and to go deeper and to be part of something bigger than ourselves that transcends this world, I wonder if that leans into and adds to that process of denying ourselves and how much soul loss and power loss we're seeing in today's day and age because we have this inherent knowing of our connection. And yet we live in a culture that doesn't allow us to explore that or encourage us to explore that in these ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I completely agree. The sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I was going to say something there. What was sorry? Was there a question there?
No, there was just an observation, but I am curious. You had mentioned in answering a question previously about this middle world and how we can do that shamanic work, whether we're in that trance-like state that you were seeing in your clients or we're in this daily waking life. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about the middle world. And I know you speak about it in some of your books, so I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yes, and it also reminds me of what I was going to say as well. So, yeah, I mean, obviously we live in a largely kind of quite, I mean, it's quite an irrational culture in many ways, but it's a culture that's kind of quite left brain dominated, obviously. And so a lot of people kind of look at things like shamanism and, think it's just woo woo and nonsense. And um, I honestly, genuinely have come to understand that shamanism is actually our sanity. It's actually not so much shamanism, animism, because shamanism is just an aspect of a much bigger thing called animism. But that animist way of being, that living in right relationship, respectful relationship with all beings. That means, all the other than human beings as well. And things like the ability to do shamanic journeys and to feel that sort of sense of connection, to be connected with ourselves, that is actually our sanity. And if you actually look at the true kind of sweep of human history, that is what we were doing for the bulk of it, for 95% of it. No? Um, and so Indigenous people sometimes say about sort of modern day culture that we're insane. And it's not just a turn of phrase. I mean, they're literally a meaning. You have gone insane. So what passes as normal these days, this kind of over rationalizing and disconnection from the other human, that's not sane at all. Um, but we think it's normal, and so people do dismiss the fact that just the sheer horror of how disconnected we are from nature. I mean, my partner, I got to the station, I've been watching a TV program or something, and there's like an aerial shot of the city. We're both spontaneously kind of go, it looks terrifying, because it is insane. There are millions of people there living completely disconnected from nature and so on, and doing jobs that they don't like and so on. Um, and this is in Shamanism what we call the middle world. This is the kind of everyday existence. And uh, our modern day human created middle world is, by any sane measure of a culture, it's deeply insane. I mean, our mental health crisis we live in. I mean, if you look at sort of graphs of anxiety levels over the years, I mean, the trajectory is terrifying. Depression and so on, and we're in an absolute mental health crisis. We've got profound inequality where what is it like 8 people own over 50% of the world's wealth and resources and so on. And worst of all, we've created the Anthropocene extinction because of human activity. Extinction rates anywhere between 20 to 200 times higher than they would be from natural causes. I mean, we are on a trajectory to wipe out anything up to 90% of the animal and plant species on the planet. I mean, this is not a sane culture, is it? Um, and so this is what we mean by the modern human middle world. And there's things we can do within that to try to fix it. I mean, there's lots of emergency measures we need to take, but ultimately the deep fix is rather than just carrying on doing the kind of things we've been doing for the last few thousand years, what if we actually look back to when were we saner? When did we have better relationships with each other and with the other than human? You're looking back at animist cultures. So if we take the principles and templates of those to rebuild our culture on, then we stand a chance. Without it, we're lost. Indigenous people sometimes refer to those templates as the original instructions or the original songs or original answers or so on. And that's what we've lost. And those were the things that kept us sane for 190,000 years or so. And it was very much the role of the shamans was to make sure that happened. Um, a lot of people think that the shaman is doing shamanic healing, and that was obviously part of it, doing things like soul retrieval. But the biggest role of the shaman was for a culture to work. Most people need to just take the stories of the culture at face value. They don't need to think not too deeply about things. They just need to get on with what they're told. And then there's a small number of people actually control the stories of the culture. That small number of people in this culture, or the psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists, were given power to. In healthy animist cultures, it was the shamans. That was their job. And part of the training of the shamans was to, as an apprentice shaman, you would have been desocialized quite a lot, quite deliberately. So you would go through months where you were told that when everybody stood up, you had to sit down. When other people sat down, you'd stand up. You had to walk backwards. You had to wear your clothes backwards. You couldn't speak normally. You had to shout at full volume, or you weren't allowed to talk at all, or all sorts of things to just mess up your socialization, basically. And and also you'd be taught a lot of sort of knowledge and things as well. And the idea was you needed somebody who understood how cultures actually work, that they're actually made up of stories that people just believe. Because then you've got somebody who can keep the stories on track according to the original healthy instructions. And that really was the role of the shaman. They were the guardians of our sanity. They kept cultures on the straight and narrow, basically. We turn away from that and we kill our shamans, and look what's happened for the last 6,000 years. This is the mess we're in.
Something that I find fascinating about that process too, of the shaman being almost like the truth keeper for a culture
Yeah.
or a tribe, is they were doing it in council with their guides and with spirit. There was not this leaning on human understanding that we see today, and I think so much of that is where we're finding that disparity now.
It's such a brilliant point. That's such a good point. Absolutely. So the a true shaman, the sort of power of a true shaman doesn't come from the human uh, and their own ego and things. Some of them have a role, to the learning stuff and things, but it comes from the guides essentially. What a shaman was an intermediary between the human world and the other than human, and so the role of the shaman was to know the teachings from the other than human, the teaching from mountain, the teaching from bear, the teaching from wolf, the teaching from springtime, the teaching from autumn, and so on and so on, and to bring these teachings to the community, essentially. And also to say, look, the other human is upset with us doing this. We need to make amends, and so on and so on. So to be the advocate and the intermediary of the other than human, that was their role essentially. So it was really firmly rooted in understanding that humans are a tiny part of a huge ecosystem. I mean, in this culture, Derek Jensen, do you know his work? Yeah, The Myth of Human Supremacy is one of my all-time favorite books. And he says, a lot of what's gone wrong is with modern culture is it's based on this myth of human supremacy. We see ourselves as some pinnacle of evolution and the cleverest of every species. And if you talk to indigenous people and say, who are the wisest of the people, they'll usually say the stone people. Now, we don't even think of the stone people as being alive, but to animist, they absolutely are. And they are the oldest and the wisest of all people. And then they say, then the next eldest are the plant people. Well, it's in the last 10, 20 years, scientists even started to recognize that plants are sentient. And the stuff that's now coming out now about plant sentience is mind-boggling to a lot of people. Animists have known this all the time. And then the next most intelligent, wise people are the other animal people. And the least wise are the humans, we're the children. And that's why we need all this guidance and teaching from the other than human people. There's a lovely story. I've got time for you to tell a story.
Please, absolutely.
There's a lovely story. I mean, I think I wrote one version of it in one of my books, but you'll find different versions of it in most cultures throughout the world. There's this lovely story that basically goes that the animal people became really furious with us humans because of how we're living and disrespecting the world. So they decided they're going to get together and kill us all, which, if they did that, they could absolutely do that. But the plant people and the stone people heard about this, so they called a great council of all the peoples. And at the council, the stone people and the plant people said to the animal people, look, we understand your anger and what you're feeling about the humans, but what you're planning to do is not in accordance with Great Spirit. It's forbidden. Um, Instead, the humans are just children who have lost their way and they need our help and guidance. So at that council, every single different type of plant and every single different kind of animal and every single different kind of stone people took on a healing gift and teaching that they would give freely to any human who asked for it. And that's the point of traveling to what's called the lower world in shamanism. It's the place where we can receive the healing teaching and gifts from the much wiser than us, other than human people. And that's how we lived sanely for nearly 200,000 years till we went mad and started to believe that we're the best.
And I find it really interesting that you can even see that in threads of different practices in humanity, like the difference between when we look back, things like or herbalism were huge, and now we have modern medicine where
Yeah,
we still have some of the plant in there, but it's not about the plant anymore. And
yeah.
even just that transition is so symbolic of this switch that has been made. But I'm curious if you could, and perhaps we should have done this at the beginning, but I'm curious if you could give us your definition of animism, because we've talked about it so much in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked actually, because I mean, shamanism's the kind of buzzword that brings people in these days, and lots of people now have heard of shamanism, but not as many people have heard of animism. And really, and the problem with that is then you get a lot of people learning shamanic techniques, but they're practicing these as a modern day human, not as an animist, and that's a completely different thing. Um, Original shamans were all animists. So basically, animism it's not a belief system, it's not religion, it's literally a way of experiencing the world around you. And what animists experience is that everything around us is alive and conscious. We live in a world of different peoples, only some of whom are human. And that's really not just a belief. When I'm teaching students, it starts off as a belief. They kind of understand intellectually that could be true. But as you do the practice, you start to experience that this is actually true. As you start to regain your sanity, really. And so animists live in a very reciprocal awareness with the world around them and a respectful awareness. And the other thing that's key to animism is it's completely non-hierarchical. One of the things I found in teaching students, I found it in myself as well, is it's astonishing how deeply ingrained into us hierarchy is, hierarchical thinking. I mean, we use things like high vibration or raising your vibration levels or higher states of consciousness or, ascending as opposed to, the depths and so on. Our language is just full of hierarchical value judgments, and we think hierarchically. Um, and the myth of human supremacy is all part of that, of course. Whereas animism is sometimes been described as a spiritual round table. All the different people are equal, essentially. There is no hierarchy whatsoever. So in animism, humans are absolutely not special. We are a tiny, tiny part of a huge ecosystem, and and so we live with that awareness of that everything is alive, everything's conscious, and everything is sacred, and that's how we should live. And that's just a very, very, very different fundamental story to base the culture onto to our modern day culture. So what shaman is an animist who has the ability to leave their body at will, travel the shamanic realms, communicate with the other than human, and then bring back the gifts of healing and teaching from the other than human world.
And we had touched on before we hit record, we had touched on our thoughts on the word shaman versus shamanic teacher. I'm curious if you could speak to that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's up to everyone to do what they want, but when Harner was putting together core shamanism, he was very clear about us referring to ourselves as shamanic practitioners and not shamans. And it was out of respect. I mean, you were mentioning how respectful he was earlier. I mean, an actual shaman is somebody who will have been, if not from birth, certainly from early childhood, that have had their gifts recognized, and they would have been raised 24/7 pretty much in developing those gifts. Most of us in the West, come to shamanism in our, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even our students, we're never going to be actual shamans. What we can be as shamanic practitioners. It's a bit like Buddhism. I mean, imagine if everybody who practiced Buddhism said they were enlightened, they were a Buddha. I mean, that's absurd. The difference between a shaman and a shamanic practitioner is a difference between being a Buddha or being a Buddhist, like practicing Buddhism. So I'd never refer to myself as a shaman. So I'm a shamanic practitioner.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think it loops back to when we were talking about having that respect for other cultures, because I think there's something to that of even as we're acknowledging the need to have an awareness of our current times and adapt for modern situations, I think it's also equally as important to recognize our ancestors and our roots and where we've come from and all of the people who have come before us to allow that knowledge to be available today. And I think that's something that Michael Harner did really beautifully in
Yeah.
allowing those practices to be brought forward, but always rooting it back in respect for those who had brought them to the present day and those cultures and aspects of practice that should remain sacred and dedicated to those specific cultures that they were
Yes.
developed in.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes, absolutely. So there are absolutely culturally specific practices that should be respectfully left in those cultures, essentially. Absolutely. Yes. Yes, I agree.
Well, Paul, it has been such an honor and a pleasure to talk with you, and I'm sure I could continue to do so for another 3 hours. So we may have to have you back on the show, but I'm curious as we
Be happy.
wrap up for today, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would love to share with our listeners?
Well, probably hundreds. I'll be very happy if you want me back at some point. I mean, it's just such a huge, beautiful, joyous, mind-blowing, fascinating uh, topic, shamanism, a way of being. It's just immensely beautiful. I mean, there's so much more we could explore, but yeah, I'm aware of time as well. It's been lovely meeting you and chatting with you. So yeah.
You as well, Paul. And if our listeners wanted to connect with you or buy one of your books or take one of your courses, where could they find you?
www.therapeutic-shamanism.co.uk. I should
Perfect.
have thought of a small,
We'll
but
put all the
that's
links in the show notes so everybody can find you, but I always like to have you share anything about yourself that you'd like to leave our listeners with.
no. I mean, if you want to find out more, I've got 3 books printed so far. I'm working on my 4th and 5th one at the moment. There's lots and lots of different courses on different aspects of shamanism. So, and there's piles of free stuff on the website. There's like loads of blogs, links to articles, other podcasts, videos, loads of stuff you can explore for free on the website. So, yeah, take a look and see if it's for you.
Beautiful. And I always like to leave with one last question. If you could give someone just starting this journey a piece of advice, what advice would you give them?
Oh, blimey. Um, well, I would read it and see if it's for you. Um, basically, you will find the wider shamanic community, like most human communities in modern day cultures, is a bit of a mess. It's a mixed bag. It's a hodgepodge of all sorts of things. Find your way around it and find the version of it that works for you, really. So, if you want to find out if this version works for you, then you could have a look at my first book. Um, you know, read some other books about it. I suppose the biggest thing is you will find lots of people trying to impose rules about this, or you're not a real shamanic practitioner unless you follow this lineage or do this or do that things. And honestly, just trust yourself, follow your instincts, trust your gut feelings. Um, don't let other people put you off. This is your birthright, basically. Yeah, don't let other people get in the way of it.
Mm, that's beautiful. Beautiful. Well, we will put the links to Paul's website and his books, as well as Michael Harner's book, The Way of the Shaman, in the show notes if you're interested in checking those out. And in the meantime, Paul, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It has been an honor, a pleasure, and a joy.
Thank you very much for having me. It's absolutely been an honor and a pleasure and a joy as well. I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, it's been great.
Beautiful. Thank you. And until next time, to everyone listening, may you also awaken to those whispers of wisdom rising from within.